Speaking of interesting, this is where we pivot to your new book. And for some people listening, this will be part two. So I will reintroduce you. Rus Bradburd, a career basketball coach, a career English teacher, a writer of 5 books, a guy that I knew almost 50 years ago. And you came out with a book called Big Time. And it is possibly the weirdest book I've ever read.
So thank you. Well, what I was after, I mean, the premise of the book, if for it's a book set in the world of sports, but the premise of the book is there's a university in the West in Colorado in trouble, and they take $1 billion buyout from Coors Beer, but Coors insists on rebranding the school as Coors State University, and all the money has to go to football and basketball. So the president at Coors State realizes this is the way of the future, and he funnels all the money into football and basketball, and half the faculty resigns. But the other half, the ones who want to stay, they have to work for the football team and the basketball team in order to survive. And so the math department starts doing statistics for them. The English department prints the programs and and writes the press releases. The business professors do the investments for the players and the coaches. The women's studies does the players' laundry, which has ruffled some feathers in my world. In order to survive, so women's studies is doing the laundry and cooking for the players. But these two old history professors who are obsessed with the 1960s, like we are, Tony,
Mhm.
they're obsessed with the 1960s. They say we're going to do like the 1960s. We're going to do campus protests, which of course are big now for different reasons because of Israel or that kind of thing. But they decide we're going to lead campus protests to take our university back from football and basketball. And the joke I remember even years ago was we want to have a university that our football team can be proud of. And at Coors State University, that it's football, and so there's these sort of futile protests that they do over and over again, and they keep falling on their face. So it's a comedy and it's a satire, but it's not so very far from the truth. Where, especially with, I was very lucky when Big Time came out. It was right when the NIL, the name, image, and likeness stuff came through.
It's absolutely crazy the your timing here. But you spent 12 years writing a book that you thought you needed to hurry to get out there before the ship righted itself,
Yeah,
before
yeah.
the NCAA figured out that things have gotten stupid crazy and we are going to fix this stuff. Instead, it's grown like a house fire.
Yep. And in fact, where you're sitting, Tony, in Illinois, and this is true in a few states, at one point, the highest paid state employee was Lovie Smith, and he wasn't even coaching. He'd been fired at Illinois. So there's taxpayer money, and all this fundraising and targeting of funds is going to pay someone and I don't, I'm sure Lovie Smith was a great coach and a nice person, but in the highest paid state employee in every state in America now is either a university basketball coach or a football coach. And it's gotten where, and what I tell people is if you send your son to University of Illinois, they're never going to meet Brad Underwood, and they're never going to meet the assistant coaches or the star players, but they're going to get taught by underpaid adjuncts who don't have health insurance until they get into their major and they reach their major, and in the upper level classes you'll get taught by well-paid professors. But the bulk of teaching now at big state universities is done by underpaid adjuncts and part-time instructors and that kind of thing that are in graduate assistants who often don't have health insurance. And so to me, it's a crazy system. And one of the inspirations for the book that I had to learn the story when I started writing the book, Mike McGrath. Have you met Mike McGrath? He's a University of Chicago coach for basketball, and he's been there for a long time.
I know of him.
Yeah, a really nice guy, and he's a big reader. We never talk basketball. We always talk about books, and he's a very successful coach at Chicago. But he told me the story of Robert Maynard Hutchins, and Hutchins was the president of the University of Chicago. University of Chicago used to be in the Big Ten, and they had Amos Alonzo Stagg, the famous football coach. And in 1936, they had the first Heisman Trophy winner, a guy named Jay Berwanger. And 3 years later, 1939, this college president, Robert Maynard Hutchins, decided it's corrupting the mission of the university. It's supposed to be about academics, and they dropped football. and they've never. And when they finally started up sports again, they're Division III, of course. Now they're play at the small college level, and they're very good. But I think he probably thought there'd be copycats after that, that people would say this is craziness, but instead, of course, it's all gone the other way. There's so much that everyone, even Chicago State wants to be Division I, and Southern Indiana wants to be Division I. Now, did you notice this past season in the NCAA tournament, St. Francis of Pennsylvania made the NCAA tournament? That's where Norm Van Leer, one of my favorite players as a kid, probably you too.
Yes, sir.
He went to St. Francis of Pennsylvania. They made the NCAA tournament. Of course, they lost in the first round, but what an achievement for them. It's a small Catholic school of like 1,500 kids. They dropped out of Division I the next day. And I think they realize this is craziness. We don't have that kind of money to compete. But the money is so great now that at places like at the University of Texas next year, Tony, the basketball team's budget for salaries for the players is over $10 million. Now think about it. Now the coach will be making $5 or $6 million. The assistant coaches I know for a fact the assistant coach is making $1 million a year. And I just have to think. I think it's a kind of craziness that I'm actually happy that the players are getting, I'm happy the players are getting paid. I think the amount is a little bit outrageous, but it swung to. This happens, of course, in politics too, where it swings too far this way, it swings too far that way. But I think in college, I do not see how the situation can sustain itself. But I felt like the only way people have been saying this for years. I'm not the only one to say this. But I've come to believe that the best news source in America is Stephen Colbert and Jon Stewart. And whatever you think of Sean Hannity or Rachel Maddow, both sides, neither of them are funny. They're not funny at all.
No.
I think through humor and comedy, you're able to get at a certain truth, that you're not able to get at by being seriously. So before we go on the air, and I said to you, I hope my hair looks okay. There's something about humor that I'm pointing out that I'm bald headed. Now, had you said, "Boy, Russ, you're bald headed," that seems offensive to me. But by making a joke out of things, I think you're able to get at a truth that serious journalism and serious fiction. So, for example, the greatest anti-war book ever written is Catch-22, and it's hilarious. No one would read Catch-22 and say, "I think I'll join the army."
No.
It would be the last thing you would do after you read Catch-22. So yeah, so I wanted to create this strange world, and I thought, at Coors State University, but I thought I've got to get this thing out there before they clean up college sports. But thank goodness for the book that college sports, doesn't seem on the verge of cleaning up anytime soon.
No, it doesn't. I love I guess I would call them the two central characters of your book, Eugene Mooney and Peter Braverton.
Yeah.
I think it's very interesting how they were both obsessed with the protest, but yet they were very different people. And we will talk about this, but I see a lot of myself in Peter Braverton, and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that's not all positive, right?
Yeah, no, that's right. And in fact, I think I'm both of those guys. On the one hand, Eugene Mooney is sort of let's work within the system. He would be more like Lou Henson. He was a gentleman, and we're going to work within the system, and we can change things from within. And Braverman is we're going to blow this stuff up. We've got to get. And I've felt both ways in department meetings. One of the real catalysts for the book was maybe in my second year, I think there was a meeting in one of the faculty meeting with the English department. And, when you're in academia, you get overwhelmed with committee work. And one of the writers that I worked with, she was new and she raised her hand and she said, I'm just only been here for a month and I'm already getting overwhelmed with committee work and I'm not able to do my own writing, which, as a English teacher, your research is your writing and that you're supposed to be doing it. And I just feel like I'm already on 3 committees and well, by the end of the meeting, they had decided to start a new committee to study how we could reduce committee work. And I just thought no one would believe this in the real world. And it's this absurd world. And I do think academics can get bogged down in incredible minutia and they can't move forward because of this committee and that committee and this committee, but nothing ever happens. The good ideas, of course, they say they go to die in committee. Like the last thing you want is for your idea to go to committee because then nothing's ever going to happen.
Yeah, your criticisms of academia, I think, are every bit as cutting as your criticisms of the sports world. In
Yes.
one paragraph, bear with me, but in one paragraph, you use the term multidisciplinary outcomes, standard-based pedagogy, evolving cross-curricular objectives, performance-based articulation, and hands-on scaffolding.
Yeah.
And to a high school teacher like me, it's not just college BS. It is high school BS, and it's middle school BS, and it's elementary, where my wife taught for 35 years. She had to put up with BS like this almost every time they got teachers together, and it almost sucked the soul out of you.
Yes, I started off sort of I think I started off thinking I'm going to make fun of the sports world, but really I think more than that, I'm lampooning academia and how paralyzed they are. You know that this has all happened. It's not, I don't want to argue about politics, but it wasn't Donald Trump that gave the Texas coach $8 million a year for football. That was all happening years before sports. The universities have been taken over, but become these money machines for sports. And as you know, most of the schools, Illinois State is losing. Illinois might be making money, but Northern Illinois is losing money hand over fist, and they keep funneling the money in there, and they don't pay their teachers. But I thought, there's the only thing we can do is to anymore, I think, is to make fun of it. I don't actually have any answers. I think in some ways, Tony, it's depressing it's the way I feel about the gun violence thing in Chicago, which that book isn't funny at all. But I just feel like I'm not optimistic about it. I don't think it's going to change anytime soon in Chicago, and I don't think that I don't think no one has copied St. Francis of Pennsylvania. No one else has dropped out of Division One and thought we can't afford this. This is crazy. Nearly everybody is losing money at it. And the argument you'll hear. So I want to just get this out on the table because some people say, well, it comes from a different pot. And the example I use is if you were walking, in downtown Joliet, and you saw some poor alcoholic guy with his bottle in a paper bag, and he's saying, and you say to him, "Look, but I could give you money, but you're just going to spend it on whiskey." And he says, "Oh no, I got money for whiskey over here in this pot. It's for something else." Well, you would never stand for that, and and the argument that it's coming from a different pot to me feels like a false argument. That I know that at many schools, if you call the University of Illinois today and say, I'm thinking of donating money to University of Illinois when I die, I'll bet you anything they'll send somebody over to try and get you to give the money to athletics. And the entire thing now is just based, just like our political system. I mentioned when we were off the air that I'm friendly with, I wouldn't say we're close, but I'm friendly with Beto O'Rourke because he sent his children to my camp. And he told me that when he was in the House of Representatives, it's every 2 years, he spends the entire time fundraising. Most of his job is raising money for the next election. And we're all so bogged down in the money issue that we can't seem to solve any real problems other than raising money.
And then, if people ask me what is, so the book is about, how crazy sports has become, the money stuff. But I would think, in my own mind, maybe that's just my own perspective, but it's really a protest book. You go through all kinds of different examples of Martin Luther King, Fred Hampton, like people that protested, and the Braverton thing really hit me hard because he saw himself as a blow it up type of protester. But then, I love this. Bear with me. He said that, Braverton said, "I was not a radical. I never marched on campus, never carried a sign. I didn't drop out, but I nearly flunked out at San Jose State too. I never took LSD. I didn't even smoke pot much until I was 40. And I didn't realize how bad the Vietnam War was until it was over. What could I do with my life? I couldn't protest Vietnam in 1980. I never did a single thing in protest of anything other than the bumper stickers on my Volvo. Yet I read a hell of a lot, and I realized over the next few years how horrible the war had been and how awful black people had been treated in America, how disgraceful it was that only 3% of women had the chance to play sports in high school. I devoured all the old issues of Ramparts, read Soul on Ice, two Angela Davis books. But by the time I had a grip on the 1960s, it was all history." And to me, that's an amazing paragraph and it kind of sums up my displaced protest stuff. You know, it kind of called me out because I've always thought I was a rebel, but I was like a quiet rebel. It was just, I have opinions, you know, I'll post something on Twitter, but when it really comes down to putting my life on the line or my job on the line or future earnings on the line, I stayed in line. And
Well, I think Braverman, as you know, it doesn't spoil the book to say it turns out by about halfway through the book, he's a blowhard. He's just been saying all this stuff, but he's not really, he's just been all talk. And that's why I think the protests at Coors State suddenly have become very important because it's his chance to finally be the rebel he's been pretending to be. But I remember, Tony, it won't surprise you to learn as bad as I was in basketball, I was probably even worse in baseball, which was my first sport. And I remember when, they'd stick me in right field. And I remember the coach saying to me, "Now, don't look up at the sky, Russ, when you're right field. Think to yourself, what am I going to do if the ball is hit to me?" And I think that's a good way to sort of live your life is that, like I'm all for Martin Luther King, but would I have got out there and marched with Martin Luther King in Chicago where they're throwing bricks at his head and that kind of thing? Like, I think it's one thing to say, oh, this is a terrible thing. But that to actually do something about it does take tremendous courage. And I think, even though what Braverman and Mooney are doing in big time in the novel, it is sort of futile, but they are trying to do something. And I do think the absolute least thing you can do to show your patriotism is to put a flag lapel pin. I don't know, and the least thing the absolute minimum you can do to protest is to put a bumper sticker on your car, to actually live the life. Would I think about that a lot. Like I'd like to think I would go out there with Mark. I'd like to think, well, and like with Sean Harrington, who we talked about from the other book, that he dives on top when the bullets went flying, he dove on top of his daughter and saved her life. A bullet went through her headrest. He undoubtedly saved her from getting killed. Now, I would like to think I would do that for my daughter, but would I act, he reacted like Rambo or something and how are we going to react? We don't really know until the bullets start flying. And maybe the same thing at your school, like, if a kid was getting picked on, are you going to stand up for that kid? Or if a teacher is being discriminated against for the wrong reason, or the fat kid is being made fun of, are you going to stand? And I tried to teach that with my daughter. I taught her this. I said, Alma, what are you going to do when they make fun of that kid in kindergarten? She would say, go play with that kid. I said, that's right. And not that I always did that, but I do think it's important to teach our kids and our athletes even, to stand up and to be. And I think that we all, as coaches, we all want our players to think, I want to be part of something that's bigger than myself. I was just at this book festival in Ireland, Tony, and I want to tell you the story real quick because I think it's a great metaphor. They said that one of the things this woman who knew nothing about sports said that when she went to, trying to talk about how her family needs to improve their, and I think for our teams, there's something called the long spoon, the metaphor of the long spoon. So imagine you're sitting around with your team. Let's say you've got your 10 basketball players and there's soup. Everyone's got a bowl of soup, but the spoons are all 10 feet long, and you're at this huge table. You can't possibly feed yourself with a 10-foot spoon. You can only take the spoon and feed your teammate across the table. And he can only feed you across the table. And this idea, it's sort of a fantastical thing to think of, the 10-foot spoon, but the idea of these, the only way that any of us can survive is if we work together. I don't know so much about track, but that's very true in basketball. To stop playing for yourself and to play for, but I would think even attitude wise for athletes, I know track can be a very individual sport, but to think about being part of something bigger than yourself, it's a hugely important thing that sports is supposed to teach people.
every good track coach, every good track team has a team approach. And so it teaches the same stuff. And when you're talking about this, it's very easy to criticize sports. But I, to this day, will say that being on a team is the greatest classroom for a young man or a young woman in the history of the world,
I completely
in
agree.
spite of all the problems.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I'm after I left UTEP, I became friends with a guy named Larry Jesse. You might not know that name, but he was the world record holder in the pole vault for a few years. In fact, he was actually training Serge Bubka at one time, probably the greatest pole vaulter ever. But Larry Jesse had the world record for 40 and over and 50 and over. Like, can you believe they're competing in the pole vault in 50 and over? But he was friends with Bob Beeman and Kip Kano and all these guys that, the Suleiman Naim Bowie and all these guys that had been stars at UTEP. And it's remarkable to me. I can't believe he's in touch with all these guys. Like, I would think that for track as an individual athlete, that, like, you just go do your thing and who cares what the pole vaulter is doing. But this pole vaulter is friends with the distance runners and the women shot putters and that kind of thing. And it sort of astounded me that this guy Larry Jesse is a really amazing person. But to think that someone on the track team is, and I know that the same with you. Even we were both terrible players in Division III, but I know that you're still in touch with guys from Europe that you might not have set the scoring record at Knox College, but and the same with me. I could tell you what everybody on the North Park team that I played with is doing to this day, and it's sort of this weird sort of family thing. And I think part of it, I was single then when I was coaching. I was never married as a coach until I went to Ireland. Um, and even then, the joke is we went on separate honeymoons together. I went back the second year by myself. But I just found it remarkable that this guy, Larry Jesse, how would he know what this Jamaican sprinter is doing? Like, why would he care? Well, it's team stuff. It's sports.
Is community. It's something
Yeah.
that, and I think too that families are smaller now. They're People are just not as well connected. Kids live indoors. I read the other day that teenage drinking is down 60%, and people say, "Oh, that's good." No, actually, that's bad because we used to get together and drink.
Oh, yeah.
That
Nobody drank by themselves, I suppose, when you're
no, right, right. What I mean, obviously, drinking is not something we want to encourage with teenagers, but at least they were getting out and feeling a sense of community that kids do not feel anymore unless they're on a sports team. So
yeah.
I think that's the thing that I wish we could get academics more like that. And I've spoken to teacher groups and stuff, and I think that there's ways to coach the classroom where kids feel like they're a part of it.
Yeah. Well, as you know, I'm in Ireland today, and that's an interesting idea. We don't want to encourage the coaches or athletes to be drinking, but in Ireland, hardly anyone, for many years especially, hardly anyone keeps liquor at the house. A beer is a Guinness or something. You go down to the pub, and there's everybody from the neighborhood, and and I remember my first few years in Ireland, my first 2 years in Ireland, almost no one invited me to their home. We'll just see at the pub, and I would not much of a drinker. I would have on a big night. I would have two Guinness, but that idea of the social element of alcohol is something that and what our phones have done and what FaceTime has done and what Facebook was supposed to connect us, but I think it's made us more distant from. I remember being very emotionally moved when my daughter told me when she was about 15, she said, "I'm going to get off Instagram because everybody on Instagram is having fun except for me." And I had to explain to her, like, actually, they're not. They're pretending. They're smiling and pretending to have a good time, but they're actually not having a good time. And it seems to go, it's a weird thing to do.
This is something that I've thought a lot about when I'm thinking about talking with you and stuff. Is that I don't know if this was a part of your thinking at all, but I kind of see like college sports today being kind of like the political scene, where the athletic minded people are kind of the ultra right capitalists. They are willing to be forceful, if not violent, to get their way. They are, you could even call them sports fascists, so to speak, whereas the academia are more like the impotent Democrats. And I'm an independent. I
Yeah,
criticize both. I criticize Republicans more than Democrats, and I'm willing to
me
say
too.
that.
Yeah.
But the faculty seems to be tied up with committees, thinking in a rational way. Um, uh, they were highly motivated by peaceful protests. I read a weird book. I'm not promoting it, but a guy named Mark Boyle wrote a book called "Drinking Molotov Cocktails with Gandhi."
That's a great title.
It's a great title, isn't it?
Yeah.
And basically, his whole idea is that peaceful protest plays in the hands of systemic violence. that when our government's doing terrible things, he had a story of a animal cruelty place where protesters protested for 5 years peacefully, and nothing happened. And then one time, somebody unknown burned the place down, and it was never reopened. So
Wow.
it's kind of like this whole idea that we are so domesticated now and so trained to be peaceful, rational, is kind of like the impotent faculty at Coors State.
Interesting. I hadn't thought. I'd have to digest that for a little while, but I do think I know. For me, we talked about Lou Henson. It might have been the last episode by today by the standards now. But I often think, what would Lou Henson do? And I do think that we were talking about phones before, how it's divided us, and I think it's changed. It now makes me think that it's probably changed politics too, where you can attack somebody on Twitter and it doesn't feel as personal. Whereas, where I think, before, my understanding was that senators would go out with each other afterward. They might disagree about the tax bill, but they would go out and have dinner together afterwards. But I remember one of my first games with Lou Henson. We went to play in the pit. Our big rival at New Mexico State is New Mexico, and Lou hadn't been back to the pit since like 1976 or whatever. So we're at the pit and we're going up right before the game. You have to walk up this tunnel. It's actually pretty steep. It would be good training for your guys to sprint up the tunnel at the pit. And you go up the tunnel, and the fans are pretty close. And this was Lou's first time back in the pit, and so he's like waving at people, even though it's a somewhat of a hostile crowd, but he's waving, and people are calling out to him. And somebody says, "Hey, Coach Henson," and he waves and smiles. And this guy unloaded the most obscene. Just I would blush to tell you what this guy said. And Lou looked right at him, and he smiled and he waved, and I thought, this guy is unflappable. Like the idea, and I do think that's a good model for all of us. And I do think WWLD sometimes, what would Lou do? And what Lou would do is he would respond with grace and dignity. And you're not going to knock me off my horse. I'm going to be civilized and polite. So I sort of, to hear you say, that peaceful protest, I don't know, Gandhi changed the world and King
He did.
changed. I'd have to think about that. But I'll write down that when we get off this podcast, I'll write down the name of that. Drinking Molotov cocktails with Gandhi. It's,
Yes.
it's maybe the greatest title ever.
For sure, for
Yeah.
sure, and it is. I mean, obviously, I read Death of a King, an amazing book about Martin Luther King's final year, where everybody had turned on him.
Yes. Yes.
Everybody, and
Yeah.
and and Malcolm X was more of like the Molotov cocktail guy, and
Yes.
and MLK was more like the Gandhi, and
Yes.
we celebrate MLK today universally, Republicans and Democrats. Um, but we don't really understand how when he turned against the war, uh,
Yes.
all hell broke loose.
Yeah, it's talk at Riverside Church and that kind of thing. Yeah, I'm here in Ireland now, as you know, and I'm in Belfast, where I think about King all the time here, where that I think we had, the people, most people in the end listened to Martin Luther King, that it wasn't by any means necessary, and let's take up guns and that kind of thing. And so I think about things went off the rail things went off the rails here in Belfast, where the Protestants and the Catholics were shooting each other. And that's left a terrible legacy. And I think, where was their Martin Luther King might have been a man named John Hume, but he didn't have everybody's ear the way King did. In general, I think most people support, like you say, they supported King, but then he went too far, saying we shouldn't be killing Vietnamese people. That was too far for King. Boy, we've gone a long way from the comic novel of Coors State University, but yeah, as you can tell, Tony, I think about this stuff all the time, and I still have, like hearing that talk about drinking Molotov cocktails with Gandhi makes me think, geez, I've got a ton to learn still.
Well, I mean, it's amazing. Like two different people could read the book and focus on different things. To me,
Yeah.
the protest part and just questioning myself, was so important. One of the things that Sasha, which was, I loved all your characters, but Sasha was a fantastic character because he seemed to have a great mind, even though he was Yugoslavian. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah, he's Croatian, but
Croatian.
he's which is this, at one time was the same thing, but now that once they split, but yeah, he's a naturally muscled up guy. He's one of the stars of the Coors State football team, and he's new to it, so he doesn't quite understand all of the fuss and why everything is being handed to him. But he falls in love with, he loves poetry. And so in order for the professors at Coors State, Braverman and Mooney that we talked about, in order for them to change the culture at Coors State University and take the university back, they need a couple football players to do it. And Sasha Dmitrievich is one of the football players that, he's enamored with poetry, and he sees the world differently than most of the Coors State athletes, and he becomes one of the supporters of the anti-football movement at Coors State. And,
I
and, and
love.
I'm sort of making, I make fun of the way I thought people would chastise me for this, but because he talks in fractured sentences, often deliberately, I think by the end of the novel, where he says, we'd call it malapropisms, where he says, or like Yogi Berra, he says things that don't make sense, but they sort of make sense also. He's sort of brilliant. He's sort of brilliant in that way. But I had fun. He was probably people often say that he was my favorite character in the book.
I think the quote in the book that I use all the time when I'm talking politics, when Sasha says, "I am on the wrong side of history," like Milosevic.
Yeah, yes. Well, and the Croatians would all, of course, hate Slobodan Milosevic. So as you've pointed out, one of the things that I think I hope comes out in big time in the comic novel is, the 60s in some ways, and political, some of those things are still with us. The civil rights movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement, and there, was it? I can't remember what Faulkner's exact quote was, but something like, history isn't history. It isn't even in the past, or something like that. You would think that an English professor would know the Faulkner quote, but it's something like that. That the past is never past. The past is never. We're never over the past. And I think it's true for all of us. Like, is there ever a day you don't think about Don Holler?
That's right. Yeah, I mean, and more so since his death. I
Yeah,
think
that's well,
death
exactly.
has a way to just plant a seed in our brain. So
Yes.
yes, I think of quotes my dad says constantly. There's any day that I'm coaching, I will say something and I'm like wanting to slap myself, like I just repeated what he said a million times.
Exactly. And so to go back to my first book, not to regress here, but when I was coaching in Ireland, I remember saying, my Irish fiddle teacher said to me once, he said early in our first year, I was sounding terrible. And he said, "It's not your fault, Russ. You weren't raised in the tradition. It's just going to take some time to learn how to do this." And about a week later, I said to my team, "It's not your fault. You just weren't." And I thought, God, I sound just like my fiddle teacher, and I think if there's nothing else to get out of sports, is that you have to use the lessons from sports, and sort of, apply them to our lives. If we can't apply, I know you've seen it before too. I've coached more guys than I would like to count that were not able to take the lessons of basketball and apply them to their life. That were not able to function in the world. And I do worry about that for these kids with NIL money. Is you're going to, so now, even Illinois, let's say Illinois State, I imagine, is going to pay their best basketball players $100,000 a year. And what does that do to an 18-year-old to have $100,000 in his pocket? Like, are they going to be wise enough to think, I think I'll invest this, or I think I'll use this to pay for graduate school, or are they going to go out and buy a Mercedes? I think about Mike Tyson quite a bit, who's a very imperfect person to say the least. But, you give him $5 million at age 19, what could go wrong? Right? So I do worry about the lessons that we're teaching these kids. And, this has been going on for years. Even when you were back at Harrisburg High School, that Scott Williams kid was being cheered for making big shots and making great passes. Was he being cheered for solving algebraic equations and being cheered?
Never.
Yeah, it's just it's a hard lesson for kids to learn, and the message has always been that, that sports has sort of that's what. So I'm here in Ireland now, and the most popular sport in Ireland is Gaelic football. They play the championship in front of 80,000 people, and it's national. everybody's playing for free. And the money from Gaelic football, they get expense money, they get food and gas and this and that, but the money from it goes into the youth programs. It's a crazy idea to think, like, what if the NBA, instead of, was actually funneling the, well, it'll never happen, of course. And it's, but the Gaelic Athletic Association has been very good about, we're going to funnel this money back into things and do it for kids and community. And their slogan is where we all belong. And and that's the slogan for Gaelic sports, and they're very good about immigrant kids are playing now, and that's what I'm working on, a new book about immigrants playing Gaelic football. But the idea of what is the lesson? What is the lesson we're trying to? And I think it's true for. I would challenge your coaches that are listening to this, Tony. I know that for. I bet you were the same way. When I get into coaching, it's because I liked kids, and I love sports, and I wanted to be around sports and kids. That wasn't the reasons I kept coaching. I kept coaching because I wanted some money and reputation. And I'm looking at your shirt now. What was that? Does it say Illinois State? Oh no, that's not Illinois State. Oh, you're from Knox College. I don't even have time for. Well, there, I think we all start putting values on people, and I caught myself doing this. Is the 6'11" guy comes in the office, and I drop what I'm doing, and the 5'10" walk-on comes in. I'm like, look, I am busy now. You're just gonna have to come back later. And I think we all, like, what is the reasons that I got into basketball were not the reasons I stayed in basketball. And I think if for all the coaches, I would challenge you to say, do you still have the purity in your heart that you started with? You love kids and you love being around kids and you love games and sports and kids, or are you doing it for the pay raise? And so what was disheartening to me is when college coaches would get together, we'd be at a basketball tournament, and you go out afterwards for dinner or whatever, and almost nobody said, "Hey, your guy was a great shooter. How do you teach him to, how do you, what were you, I watched you guys, how do you, can you show me your zone offense?" No, it was all about who signed what contract and who was going to get that job. That was all they talked about. That's all anybody talked about when coaches get together in the summer. Maybe it's different now. They might talk about what players are going to get paid this and that from their NIL. And I find it even with writers sometimes is sometimes writers can get together and talk about book contracts and agents. I don't want to talk about book contracts and agents. I want to talk about Hemingway. Like, to me, the least interesting part about being a writer is the book contract and the agent, which is always going to be frustrating. And I've never gotten a big advance. It's not like I have much to talk about anyway. But I do think it's for me that I was constantly trying to remind myself when I was coaching, and it's part of the reason I walked away, is I felt like the reason that I got into coaching was not the reason I stayed in coaching.
I love that. I was going to circle back to your Gaelic Athletic Association. One of the things I learned in my time in Ireland is the mission statement is so beautiful there. We want our kids to play as many sports as possible for as long as possible. And I thought to myself, America, our mission statement is more like the problems of big time.
Yes,
It's NIL, it's scholarships, it's contracts.
yes, yes. And I've come to believe, if you've got Jabari Parker on your team, he doesn't need your help. It's the kid on the end of the bench that needs the help. And it's one of my frustrations with sports is that I think if you took Rick Pitino, I think Rick Pitino could go solve the Middle East crisis. Like, he's that brilliant and that talented,
Yes.
and he spends all his time, you know, trying to get a 7-footer. And I think it's the same thing. Even at, I've found this at Marshall High School, where I've heard the coaches there tell me, that basketball really saves these kids. And that's great that, the 12 kids on the varsity now have, of course, it can't save them from gun violence on the street, as I found out. But my feeling is, if there's at Plainfield North High School, if there's only 40 kids involved in the basketball program, what about the other kids? What about the kid who's a little bit overweight, or the kid with the limp, or the kid who never, was uncoordinated? Like, and especially, I think, especially in our inner cities, Tony, we can't just rely on basketball to save every kid, because not every kid's going to get a scholarship. Not every kid's going to go to the NBA. What about those other kids? And so, while it's great that basketball has saved so many kids, I think our challenge as coaches is to not forget, to try and help the other teachers and not forget about the other kids, because they're not going to like, I think when you and I started playing, you probably thought you were going to be Jerry Sloan or Norm Van Leer, but it's never going to happen. And if you can't use the lessons from sports to move on, but there are other kids that, what about that fat kid in the band? How come everybody cares about Jabari Parker or LeBron James when they're teenagers in high school? And what about the kid who plays the tuba in the band?
That's so important, and that's a story that I think that my dad, who played for a Gay Kintner, a Hall of Fame coach, an amazing man, he learned from that father figure, because my dad had a rough home life, that that it's the difficult kids that need educators, not the 6'11" basketball player, but that 5'8" backup point guard
Yeah,
that's
and
from a tough home.
where did Don Holler grow up?
He played for the Runnin' Reds of Decatur High School.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah, okay, yeah, yeah.
uh,
Well, at that time, Decatur, it probably still is, but it was a sports hotbed, the Decatur Staleys. And didn't George Halas first start out in Decatur?
I believe so.
Yeah,
My
yeah,
dad played every varsity basketball game. It's a charter bus to every city. They played in like 4 states.
yeah,
But their home Gay Kintner gym held
yeah.
more people than Huff Gymnasium at the University of Illinois. So
Wow.
my dad was playing in front of bigger crowds than
Yeah,
than the players at the U of I did. And so, but the fact that that taught me, and when I speak with teachers, I try to tell them I think teachers are worse than coaches. You mentioned, that 6'11" kid walks in and you drop everything. That 5'8" kid walks in, you go, hey, maybe I'll have time for you tomorrow. Teachers really like kids that are similar to the way they were, which means they were good at school. They probably had good parents. They were read to as kids. And what I try to tell teachers, those kids don't really need you. Instead, it's the kids that weren't read to, that maybe do not have two parents at home.
yeah.
Those kids that may fall off the cliff if not for you. But those kids actually make teaching hard, which a lot of teachers don't like.
Yeah, well, I think that's very true. And I only met Rick Majerus. I can count on one hand the times I met Rick Majerus, but I remember him telling me that he thought it was really important to coach your 10th, 11th, and 12th man. Well, that's something to take into the classroom too. You have to teach your worst students. But the other thing it made me think of that you said is that, with all this money in NIL and how it's going to corrupt our university. Now imagine if you're at the University of Illinois and there's a basketball player who's making $800,000 a year, but he's not doing the work in class and he's not coming to class. Are you going to be able to flunk that kid who's making $1 million a year? I think the pressure on teachers to just give the athletes a pass was already huge. There was already at New Mexico State they had a rule: the coaches weren't allowed to call the teachers. But at UTEP, Haskins wanted us to call the teachers and say, and we had tried to have a good attitude about it. We just, how's Antonio doing in class? Let us know if he misses class, that kind of thing. But I think that was seen at New Mexico State as pressure. We were never allowed to pressure what they felt like was pressuring the teachers and calling teachers. But can you imagine if you've got a kid in your class who's not the star quarterback at University of Miami? You're really going to flunk that kid for cheating on the test or not? I just think it's really going to corrupt our. And so remember I said that. Why did we get into coaching in the first place? Why were universities formed in the first place? It wasn't to become sports and entertainment factories, and that's what's. But now I always have to say, Tony, you went to Knox College and I went to North Park. I do think that Division II and Division III totally, and Division II to a slightly lesser extent, it's one of the last pure forms of sports, particularly on the college level. And especially now they're going to drop gymnastics and they're going to drop women's tennis and they've dropped men's volleyball somewhere that made Grand Canyon was in the Final Four in men's volleyball, gone. Men's volleyball gone. They're in the final, and that's a school with a lot of money. And I think where we're headed now is we've lost sight of what and again I'll put my cards on the table. I'm not a big fan of Donald Trump. You can't blame Donald Trump for that. The schools were completely out of control in terms of being run by football teams and basketball teams well before this administration.
And yet I understand why people see sports as being bigger than academics. And one of the things, this is my last quote I'll read from your book. but they had stressed how athletics was the only measurable part of the university. Academic departments did not keep score or get compared to conference rivals. And in a free market, capitalist society, nobody would pay a nickel to hear about Chaucer, colonialism, or atomic fusion. That's what Wikipedia was for. What people really wanted, the students in town and supporters and alumni, was a damn good football team.
Well, and I think that's really I think that's well. Thank you for holding the book up. But I think that's very true. I think that's part of the reason. One of my frustrations I notice is that how efficient the sports side of thing was at the university and how completely inefficient with the committees and everything and the language that the academic side was. Is that if the volleyball assistant coach left, we had a new volleyball assistant coach. A few weeks later they hired somebody else. At New Mexico State, they haven't had we went about 25 years without a Mexican history professor. Now, how can that be? We're a half hour from the border and no Mexican history professor. And what I found is that a professor leaves or retires or takes another job, and it would be years until they were able to, they called it the teaching line. It was years before the bureaucracy could get around to giving you that teaching line back, and we replaced that person. And so I do find that with the cutthroat world of college sports, things were, and I think you probably know the New York Times writer Ezra Klein. He talks about that what we have done on the progressive side is we've created this incredible bureaucracy and nothing can get done. And I think that's what's happened in academia is nothing actually gets done. Whereas in sports, it happens too quickly. The head coach wants this, we're going to get it, and we just railroad things into place. Whereas in academia, it just gets lost in committee and in the language, and nothing ever happens, and we get paralyzed. So we have a situation like at New Mexico State where we go 25 years without a Mexican history professor, and we wouldn't go 25 days without an assistant basketball coach.
Yeah, I'm sure you remember Ed Hightower.
Yeah, the referee.
Yes,
Yes.
he was the superintendent at Edwardsville High School, where my
Oh,
son is
I
still
didn't
coaching.
know. Oh, I
Yeah,
didn't
he's
know. Yeah,
superintendent there, and
yeah.
and he was superintendent when my son Alec took took the job there, and Alec is still there. But Ed Hightower believed that athletics was the window to the school, kind of saying the same thing that your book said, is that if you want to have a school that's well thought of, you have a great football team, have a great basketball team. I used to say that I was a very good chemistry teacher, but nobody ever knew it except for my students. Like
Yeah.
nobody, there was no window.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know. I'd have to chew on that for a while because I do think like University of Chicago did not go along with they wind up dropping football and I don't know if Alonzo Stagg was the coach then or not, but when you think of University of Chicago, you think of their great economics school and they're famous now for saying there are no, which I agree with, there are no safe spaces, particularly when you're teaching English. We're gonna rattle you and make you think. I think is a healthy way to think about it. But when I think about Yale, I don't think about their men's basket. They had a pretty good men's basketball team, I think, this year. But I don't. Or Harvard had a great women's basketball team this year. But I don't think about. I don't know. I'd have to consider that. Like I think if my daughter said I want to study political science, I'd say, oh, George Washington or Johns Hopkins. I don't know that. I'd have to think about. Let me think about that. I'm supposed to have
My,
all the answers on the podcast, and I don't.
I have thought a lot about it,
Yeah.
and my thought is you can do both.
Oh
That
well.
you can understand that it's really important at Plainfield North High School to have a good football program, and a good basketball program, a good track program, and a great band, and all those things, because that is what the public's going to see the most. But then if we could get academia more like that, and we don't get there by keeping score. Standardized testing has been just horrible for public schools.
Yeah.
So their attempts to keep score in class has not worked very well. So I think that you can do both. And getting back to the impotence of academics, though, I've often said that I've probably had 12 different superintendents in my career, people that ran the school system, and they were so bogged down in committees and new mission statements and blah 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 that they really didn't get much done. And I would say that if they were a football coach, they'd be 0-9 every year.
Yeah,
But no,
I don't know.
nobody keeps score.
Well, that's the thing. But the problem with they call it a zero sum game where, if we all play poker tonight, not everybody's going to say, "Hey, I won $40." We all won $40. It's amazing. That doesn't happen, and sports is like that as well. So I wonder about that because in the Big Ten, it's just not to pick. I'm not don't want to pick. Well, there's not 10 teams anymore. Well, let's just pretend there's 10 teams in the Big Ten. Every English department could get better. And every English department could get, but not every basketball team. Somebody's going to come in last place, and then the coach gets fired. And so I wonder about that. Is it? I think with academics, it's not a zero sum game. So there's not
Agreed.
winners and losers in academics. No, they're not firing the English department at Illinois because they're not as good as Iowa, but they're firing the football. They're firing the football coach. If Purdue keeps losing to Indiana, that could really force the football coach out. But if Purdue's English department is not as good as Indiana, is that going to matter? So I don't know. It's a double-edged sword. You're making me think about more things than I want to think about anymore. I'd like to. I've already written about this stuff, and I'm trying to move on to Gaelic football. But yeah, that I think that's all interesting to think about.
I did not get to see Gaelic football when I was there last July, but I did sit with a guy from Limerick that was very, very excited about Limerick playing Cork in hurling,
Oh
which
yeah, well they just
another
got
great sport.
yeah for the first time in about 5 years, Limerick is out of the playoffs now, I guess in hurling. But I would encourage your listeners to just go to YouTube and Google Irish hurling or Gaelic football, and you'll see it's a strange. They're strange games to the American eye at first, but they're very fast moving games, and it's 15 against 15, so it gets a lot of people involved, and they both have great traditions, and they do play Gaelic football in Chicago a little bit. There's a place called Gaelic Park. I think it's near Tinley Park in the south suburbs. But there are little pockets of Gaelic football around the world, but it's mostly a purely Irish. They played a little bit in England and a little bit in Australia, although Australia has Australian rules football, which is somewhat similar. But I would encourage your listeners to go look up hurling, which is the fastest sport in the world, I think, and it's crazy how fast they go. And look up Gaelic football because the rules are sort of the same, but they're really breathtaking to watch on television.
And it seemed to me like every player was like 6'2", 190, fast, explosive. It was a violent game, but not a single fight in Limerick versus Cork. Not
Oh
a
no.
single fight.
Yeah, and in hurling, they're all using it's like a hockey stick, but it's somewhere between a lacrosse stick and a hockey stick. And I think somebody's going to get killed with these things, but you very rarely have a hurley stick, knocking. They all wear helmets now, of course, but it's like hockey, American or Canadian hockey, where they at one time, no, when we were kids, no one was wearing a helmet. I remember when the first guy on the Blackhawks wore a helmet. I can't think who it was, Cliff Coral or somebody. But now, of course, everybody's wearing a helmet. Anyway, yeah, it's well, that's interesting. But I gotta encourage your listeners to go Google Gaelic football or look at it on YouTube.
Well, besides everybody going out and buying big time, I got two questions to end this. One is why do you spend your summers in Belfast?
Well, I had come over, I fell from Paddy on the Hardwood, my first book. I fell in love with Irish music. So I come back, I'm a devoted fiddle player now, which nice thing about music is I don't have to worry about ruining my knees, and I can do it for almost for the rest of my life, I hope. But I love Irish music. So I'm coming back to Ireland all the time. But I came over here in 2022. I won a Fulbright, an academic award and my proposal was to study how immigrant children, to write a book about how immigrant kids, the Syrians and the Ukrainians, are being funneled into Gaelic football. So one thing that's happened in America for many years is if you move to America, say from Korea or Pakistan, and or Ireland, even if you never played baseball, you stuck your kids into baseball. At one time, uh, the most baseball players from any European country to this day is still Ireland. Is that at the turn of the century, there were so many Irish immigrants coming, and they didn't play baseball in Ireland, but they wanted to be part of America and they played baseball. Well, that's happening now in Belfast, in Northern Ireland. Lots of immigrants are coming in. It used to be a violent city, and people are fleeing violence to come to Belfast, and they're sticking their kids into Gaelic sports, and it's built these bridges as sports, as we know that sports do. So that's why I keep coming back to Ireland, is I want to finish finish this book and find. I've got an agent now, and I'm trying to find a publisher for this book. It's called Almost Like Belonging, which is a play on the slogan for Gaelic sports here is where we all belong. And it's almost like it's almost like you're Irish if you learn to play Gaelic football.
I love it. And then finally, I'm always looking for my next book. Give me some book recommendations, things that you have read.
Well, one that I was all set to dislike is a book by a man named Dave Hollander. It's called How Basketball Can Save the World. And I thought I knew everything about basketball, and I'd thought about it, but he connects dots that I hadn't thought of in a long time. And I've never met Dave Hollander, but I want to meet Dave Hollander. But yeah, it's called How Basketball Can Save the World. My favorite Irish writer these days is a woman named Claire Keegan. It's Keegan, and she's written a couple books, but she has a couple long. They're like novellas. One is called Foster, and one is called Bright Things Like These. No, wait. Wait a minute, I'm getting the name wrong. You would think that I love the book, and I've taught it several times. Small Things Like These. Sorry, Small Things Like These, and Foster by Claire Keegan. It's a woman writer, but she's my favorite Irish writer these days. So I'm those are my at the end of the Ezra Klein podcast, he always says, "Give us three books that you love." So those are three books, and I could talk forever about books I love, but those are the ones I've read lately that I loved.
Was there a book in your early career, college? Is there a book that turned you on to reading more than any other book?
Well, it was reading the books and meeting Antonia Nelson and Robert Boswell. They're a married couple, but they became my mentors. Robert Boswell, who loves basketball, and Antonia Nelson, who does not. But they're great novelists and short story writers, and they happened to be teaching at New Mexico State when I got there. So I met Robert Boswell very early. I met him actually my first day on campus, and we became fast friends. And he always wanted to talk about basketball, and I always wanted to talk about books. And in the end, Tony, I would like to say that I won, because he doesn't even watch basketball anymore. But he would sat in like row 3 at the basketball games, and after nearly every game that I ever coached at New Mexico State, I would go to Robert Boswell's house, and he would want to talk about the game, and I would want to talk about Hemingway or Richard Ford or Dagoberto Gilb, or or that kind of thing. But they were a huge influence on my life. As Robert Boswell and Antonia Nelson really changed my life, in that they were, even though I was probably the worst writer in the class most of the time, like you talked about before, they paid attention to me as sort of the worst player, and they treated me with respect, and it really motivated me to become a writer. And so I'm still, I've always sort of looked. I was very lucky in my life that I had Dan McCarroll and Don Haskins and Lou Henson, but Robert Boswell was a huge influence in my life.
Wow, that's so cool. And you're still somewhat involved with basketball?
Well, the only thing I do, I'm the color analyst for New Mexico State home games. I get $250 a game, and I love it, because it's fun, it's exciting, and if we lose the game, I'm sad. But by the time I get home, I'm over it. Unlike when I was coaching, and so I do that, and then I do 10 or 12 home games, and it's just fun to do I'm the color analyst, so I only do 10% of the talking. And then I do a little camp in El Paso. You'll have to come sometime. It's called Basketball in the Barrio, and I've been doing. We did our 33rd year this year, and so I've been doing it. The kids pay $1. Little kids. It's 100 yards from the Mexican border. They pay $1, and they get a book, a harmonica, a T-shirt, a chess set, a jump rope, and a poster, all for $1. And we mix in basketball and these sort of educational activities, and music and storytelling from the border. So it's really a great joy. But we're never going to get a great player out of it. But it's really maybe the thing I'm proudest of is, if I have any legacy at all, Tony, it's this Basketball in the Barrio. It'll be our 34th year next. We're going to try and get Shaquille O'Neal. He was the famous number 34. It'll never happen, but that's our goal. We'll get Shaquille O'Neal to come to Basketball in the Barrio.
Well, he'll probably listen to this podcast though, and
Well,
who knows, right? Who
well,
knows?
well, that's right. But we've had all kinds of famous people have been there. Well, when I say famous, Arnie Duncan, the U.S. Secretary of Education, came, and John Carlos, from the
Yes.
1968 Olympics, he's been there. Babito Garcia, the famous hip hop DJ and announcer. He's been there. We've had Beto O'Rourke comes to camp most years, and we've had NBA players, but it's just for fun and to try and do something educational, help the kids in the barrio.
And I said as my last, but since you started to name drop there, I've got to hear my childhood hero, guy I read, Zeke from Cabin Creek, when I was in fifth grade. Tell me about Jerry West.
Well, I was lucky that when I was doing my dribbling drills, for a long time, and at one point Dick Versace called me and said, "I've got somebody for you to work with. It's Johnny West." And I said, "Well, it sounds like a country western star." He said, "No, it's Jerry West's son." Dick was the whatever he was at the time, assistant GM or GM for the Memphis Grizzlies. So I went to work with Jerry West's son, and the second day they brought Shane. Well, that was actually to work with Shane Battier and Johnny West. So I spent a week with Battier and Johnny West, and Jerry asked me to come out to L.A. to work with his son again, and this time with Earl Watson, a guard who was a longtime NBA guard, who's actually his mother's from Mexico, but to work with Earl Watson and his son at the guy who owned Reebok. No, LA Gear. He owned LA Gear. He was a neighbor of Jerry West, but he had a Lakers replica gym in his backyard. If you can imagine having a gym that was like the LA Forum in your backyard. So I went and worked with Johnny West for 2 different weeks, and I'm completely out of touch with Johnny West, who I think is an NBA executive now. But I used to get Christmas cards from Jerry West every year, and I was done with coaching by then. I only wanted to be a writer, and Jerry was a big reader, so he endorsed my book Patty on the Hardwood, and I would always send him my books when they came out. But had I known Jerry West when I was wanting to be a coach, it could have really changed my life. But I was just honored to get to know him, and a little just I didn't know him well, but I would go pick Johnny up at his house every morning, and we would drive. It was still a few hundred yards away to drive to the gym, and there would Jerry West be in his pajamas eating cereal and looking like a normal person. He wasn't like God at all. But it was a real thrill for me to meet Jerry West because he was one of my heroes as a kid, and he was very driven, and yeah, I'm like this a little bit. He was a big fear of failure guy, and I think had a negative motivation. He grew up with a terrible father, and that's a pretty good book, by the way, the Jonathan Coleman book called My Charmed Life. I think it's called. Jonathan Coleman co-authored it with Jerry West. That's a very good book because it exposes the dark side of Jerry West and what he had a lot of demons, I think.
You got a promise to come on the podcast again when your next book is published?
Well, I promise if people are still listening, and you've got to get down to basketball in the Barrio. That might be fun if we can get Roy down there, and Danny Edwards came to camp. Danny Edwards
Oh,
from Murfreesboro came to camp once.
sure.
Yeah.
Danny and I, we stay in contact. Yeah, I would love to do that. That would be an amazing thing. And I've learned so much about El Paso through your books and
Yeah,
stuff.
maybe you do the podcast from basketball in the Barrio sometime.
Oh man, that would be a
That might be a way to do it. Let's
that
book that. It's
that
always
give
Father's Day weekend. If you can get away for Father's Day, we do it on Father's Day because a lot of those kids don't have fathers, and so that's always part of the talk is that your father, he could be a father figure, it could be your coach or your uncle or your grandfather. It doesn't have to be. If you don't have a dad at home, that's okay. It's an important message, I think, to tell kids from poor families.
yeah. And then if I'm going down there as a work thing, I can write it off.
Yeah, except for that we all do it for free, so you're not getting paid. Everybody's a volunteer. Although we do pay the musicians and the dancers, they get paid a little bit.
They always get paid.
Tony, it's great. It's great to see you again. I'm so happy to reconnect with you and think about the national. But now my head is spinning. I feel like I've got a lot of things to think about rather than I have more, as usual. I have more questions than answers.
Well, we'll talk again.
Good enough. All right. Thanks.
Thanks, Russ.
Okay. All right. Bye bye.